Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to this week's edition of Advanced Bass Fishing, and thanks for joining us for today's episode. I really appreciate that. And guys, I know it's a big time commitment to if you watch the whole video on these advanced bass fishing videos because they're a lot longer than my normal ones. So thank you very much for you guys putting the time in on that. I really appreciate it. And guys, we had a really good seminar for y'all today. We're going to be talking about all of my favorite spring bass fishing techniques. There's a lot of different ways to catch bass in the springtime of the year, depending upon what part of the country you're in. But I've got some of my favorites here. I've got probably about a dozen different lures that I really like in the springtime of the year. So we're going to go over to that in today's video because each one of these techniques that we're going to talk about, they've got different applications based upon, just all the variables in fishing, things like your different water clarities, different water temperatures, the type of lake, all that type of stuff. So I think there's going to be something for everybody in this particular episode. Also, guys, before we get started, just our weekly housekeeping tip to keep the lights on here for the Advanced Bass Fishing channel. I'd just like to invite everybody, if you guys like the content here of Advanced Bass Fishing, please hit that subscribe button. And probably the best thing that you can do to support the channel is to go into my links in the description. And if you want to purchase any of the baits I'm talking about here in the video, if you use my Tackle Warehouse link, and I'll link all the baits in that description. If you guys use that link, the channel gets a small commission out of anything you guys buy. So that's a really good way to support the channel along with all the other links we put in there. So really appreciate you guys' support on that. Okay guys, let's dive right into this. And what I'm going to try to sort of do here is I'm going to try to, when I classify spring bass fishing, I'm sort of talking about the late pre-spawn, the spawn, and the early post-spawn. So I know spring varies, depending upon where you're at, and sometimes it's longer than others, but for all practical purposes, I sort of want to go by water temperature in relationship to the spawn. So what we're talking about here for most lakes is the techniques that I'm talking about are going to be sort of between when the water temperature is between 55 and 70 degrees in the springtime of the year. And for the most part, in the spring, these techniques we're talking about, it's going to be something like maybe what works good 3 to 4 weeks before the fish actually start spawning, maybe probably about 3 weeks, and then probably 2 or 3 weeks after the fish are done spawn, sort of that spring time frame with that. So I'm going to go through everything that I like to use this time of year. I know there's a lot of other stuff that works, don't get me wrong, and there's a lot of other stuff I do use, but I sort of want to go through some of the things that have been really productive for me. And not only I'm going to go through the lure, but once I talk about each lure, I'm sort of going to describe the best scenario for that particular lure. Okay guys, let's get it right into this. Right off the bat, we're going to be talking about probably it's probably one of the most diverse, universal, productive spring bass fishing lures is the old wacky rig. Wacky rig, it doesn't matter if you're using a soft plastic stick bait or trick worm or something like that. I prefer, most of the time a soft plastic stick bait. This is that Zoom's Linky here. Usually got it rigged on like a 2 or 3/0 Gamakatsu straight shank, nano coated G finesse. A lot of words for a Gamakatsu G finesse nano coated heavy cover worm hook, 2 to 3/0 in the worm like that. Now the wacky rig, guys, it's probably if you had one lure to throw in the springtime of the year, especially when the water temperature is close to 60 degrees, the wacky rig is going to be hard to beat. There's very few lures that can compete with a wacky rig in terms of catching numbers of bass and size of bass. It's like most of the time you got some type of you sacrifice the number of bites to get bigger bites, or you sacrifice bigger bites to get the number of bites. But in my experience, a wacky rig is probably the number one lure that does both. So if you don't fish a wacky rig, get comfortable with it, guys, because it's really good in the springtime of the year. So the rigging is pretty important, guys. I talked about this in some other videos, but if you haven't seen it, I just want to get into it real quick before I get into type of areas. A lot of people on a wacky rig, they put that plastic collar on it there, and they put the plastic collar and then they rig it like this. You don't want to do that. Just don't use a collar. Just hook the worm, right through the center, just like this. You're not going to lose that many worms with it. And the worm falls a lot more natural when it's like this. And then also you don't have that strike deterrent of the O-ring there. So it's a lot more cleaner looking. So this is definitely how I prefer to fish it. Most of the time I'm fishing it on anywhere between, say, 6 to 10 pound test, 6 to 10 pound test Seaguar and VizX line. Now, line test depends upon the type of stuff I'm fishing with it. If I'm fishing really clear water and I'm trying to get the bait down deeper, which is usually, a little bit in the pre-spawn, I may go to 6 pound test line. Most situations I'm using 8 if I'm fishing around some type of clean areas that's not real thick. But if I'm fishing around some areas that maybe are a little bit gnarly, maybe you got grass beds around, you got a lot of trees or something around, that's when I'll go up to 10 pound test. But I never go over 10, 6 to 10 pound test for that. So for the wacky rig, guys, as far as where you want to fish it in the springtime of the year, for me, it's all about getting in those areas that the fish are getting ready to spawn in. Now, it is a good lure for, right when the fish are spawning and they're in that mode, but it's also a really good lure for before and after the spawn too. So the best areas for a wacky rig are that whatever lake that you're fishing, it doesn't matter, if you're in a grass lake or a rock lake or whatever, most people that are watching the channel sort of understand what a traditional spawning area is. Spawning areas, the best spawning areas are going to be hard bottoms, they're going to be protected from the wind, they're going to be a little bit flatter. They're going to have some type of an access to deep water. It doesn't have to be super deep all around. Bass usually like to spawn either around a piece of cover or a little bit deeper, just barely out of sight. So flatter banks, hard bottom is the main thing with that. And that's what you're fishing the wacky rig in. Now let me give you guys a perfect scenario as far as how I fish it based upon different situations. Let's say, for example, I'm on Table Rock Lake down here. Table Rock Lake is a highland lake, it's a rocky lake, it's a clear water lake. And say I go into there and the water temperature is 55, 57 degrees and I know the fish aren't spawning yet, but it's close. Like, we're almost into April right now. So if you're getting close to April and the water temperature is not 60 and you're not seeing any fish on beds yet, get in those same type of areas where you think the fish are bedding and simply throw it out deeper. If you think the fish are going to be bedding in 2 to 4 foot of water, move out to maybe 6, 7, 8, 10 foot of water, cast that wacky rig out there on the 6 pound line, let it sink all the way to the bottom, work it probably 2 or 3 feet. If you don't get a bite, reel it in. Thing about wacky rig is the fish hit it 90% of the time, either on the way down or the first couple feet you move it. So you don't have to work it like all the way back to the boat. So just basically work it out a little bit deeper, around those type of areas. Another area that's really good to throw a wacky rig on, but sometimes you got to have a weedless hook on it, which is different from the one I showed you, is around some type of shallow cover or docks. Skipping a wacky rig like up underneath the dock walkways, guys, is killer technique. Around here in my part of the country, that's a big deal. It's like you take a spinning rod, skip that wacky rig up under the boat dock, under the walkways there. A lot of fish use that water in the springtime of the year. They don't get a lot of pressure back in there. Really good way to catch them. Any type of standing timber is good. Cypress trees, dock pilings. If you don't have walkways on your dock, if you have floating docks under the walkways, if you got a pier dock, sometimes just cast it up there underneath the shade of the pier. Throw it underneath overhanging trees, shady areas, isolated stumps, whatever shallow cover that you have in there. And don't really one of the things about it, even though you're using just an open hook like this, it's pretty weedless. I mean, unless you throw this thing like in the middle of a lay down tree, it comes through stuff pretty good. So don't get real, bent out of shape about throwing it in a little bit thicker cover with that open hook. So anyway, wacky rig, hard to beat. Most of the time the color's on it, I'm using a green pumpkin or a watermelon. If the water does have a little bit of color to it, or if I'm fishing in some areas that have grass around it and it's a little bit more tannic colored, then I'll go to maybe a June bug or a red bug, something like that. And in real clear water, I like something like a salt and pepper, some type of shad colors, works really good. So that's for the wacky rig. Next one, guys, is sort of on the same lines there, which if I had to rate my 2 most productive baits as far as catching numbers on over the years, it's going to be that wacky rig and then a shaky head. Guys, a shaky head is absolutely deadly in the springtime of the year. It's without a doubt, it's my favorite time of year to fish it. Now, most of the time, what you have, if you can catch some fish on a wacky rig, there's usually a shaky head bite going on at the same time. They sort of intertwine with each other. Very seldom have I ever been fishing in the springtime of year where I can catch them on a wacky rig and I can't catch them also on a shaky head. Now, the difference in that is there's a couple different things. Number one, it's just what the bass prefer that day. Sometimes they prefer the wacky, sometimes they prefer the shaky head. For the most part, what I've seen is they like a shaky head a little bit better in the pre-spawn, and they like the wacky a little bit better sort of in the spawn or the post-spawn a little bit. That's sort of been the experience with that. Another thing that you want to consider with a shaky head is if you have a day that it's like really windy, a lot of times you can catch more fish on a shaky head than you can a wacky, simply because it's heavier, it sinks, goes down to the bottom quicker. You can keep in contact with the bottom. So on those days that are really, really windy, sometimes it's very difficult to fish a wacky rig, and you have to go to the shaky head. But the main thing that I really, really like the shaky head for is when those fish are a little bit deeper and they're in that true pre or post spawn phase. Now, one of the things that they do in that, we talked a little bit about the spawning type areas with the wacky rig, that notoriously before the spawn and after the spawn, bass like to set up on any type of secondary point within coves or creeks. So let's say, for example, you've got a big spawning cove and fish are going to be spawning in the back of it. A lot of times in those big coves, you'll have some small subtle points leading back into those coves, or sometimes you'll have the actual point itself that's on that's part of the cove, which is a secondary point within the creek there. And a shaky head is deadly on secondary points. Doesn't matter if you got water visibility of 2 feet or water visibility of 20 feet. Especially if you have a lake that has a mixed species. If you guys have a lake that has a lot of spotted bass, smallmouth and largemouth and clear water, those fish stack up in the pre and post spawn on those secondary points, and there's not a better lure to catch them on than shaky head. Now, for the most part, guys, the shaky head I really like is the 1/16 of an ounce. This is the Gamakatsu shaky head here. I'll link it in the description. I'll link all this stuff in my description here for the video. But I really like a 1/16 of an ounce for a couple different reasons. Number one, it makes the worm fall a little bit slower. I think it's a little bit natural looking. Since it's a lighter head, it doesn't get hung up near as much. It tends to glide over the rocks. And the small head on it like this allows you to skip the bait really good. If you try to skip a shaky head under any type of an object with like an 1/8 ounce head or bigger, it's very difficult to do it. It just, as soon as you try to skip it, it just catches that water. But you can skip a 1/16 of an ounce really good. And this is, guys, this has been one of my big secrets forever, is using a 1/16 of an ounce head, on your trick worm or your finesse worm. And probably 90% of the time, guys, I do use the full size zoom trick worm. A lot of people use the finesse worm smaller. I do at times, but I just get a lot of bites on the regular size trick worm like this. Any type of watermelon or green pumpkin is good with that. And most of the time I'm fishing it on, just like with the wacky, 6 to 10 pound test Seaguard Vizex. Same deal. If it's really clear and I'm fishing it deeper, I'll go to 6. Most of the time I like to fish 8. If I'm skipping it around heavy cover, like skipping it up underneath docks or skipping it around, any type of wood or grass, then I'll go to 10 on that for the most part. But guys, those two lures, as far as a shaky head and a wacky rig, if you don't fish them, you got to fish them. They are, without a doubt, the two best spring lures overall for most any lake in the country out there. Now, there's obviously, it's situational. It's a tool like anything else, but man, you have got to get confidence in those. It's going to catch you a ton of fish, at some point down the road. So I'm going to take a quick break, get something to drink, and we will be back with the continue on here with the seminar. Okay, guys, now we're back, and we're going to be getting into a little bit different lure categories now that are a lot more situational than the shaky head and the wacky rig. And first of all, guys, a lot of these baits that I'm talking about are Megabass lures, because you guys know I've been with Megabass since 1992. It's not that you have to get these lures. That's what I use, but it's basically the lure category. So when I'm talking about a Megabass crankbait, if you like a different brand, get a different brand, whatever it is. This is just what I'm talking about. So you can apply the lures that I'm talking about to different lure companies and categories, brands, if you are more comfortable with that. Okay guys, the next one I want to talk about is a square bill crankbait. This is the Megabass S-Crank 2.0 in the springtime of the year. Now this bait right here is specifically for the pre and the post spawn. Doesn't work during the spawn when the fish are spawning very well at all. And another thing, which you'll find about, when the bass really get locked in and get focused big time on spawning, they don't like lures like a crankbait that come horizontally through the water column. They want a bait that is on the bottom, like a shaky head or a wacky rig. So remember that is when the water temperature starts to get around 60 degrees and you start noticing some beds, change your techniques to the bottom baits, like creature baits, jigs, shaky heads, whatever, and stay away from your baits like your spinner baits and crankbaits until they get done spawning there. Just sort of a mood and personality deal. But my two situations for a square bill, guys, is in the pre-spawn and the post-spawn. I want to sort of talk a little bit about what to look for in that. Now, there's a wide variety of the type of square bill, guys, but one of the things that I have found about in the springtime of the year, they like the larger size. Now, in the summertime and the fall time, I go to a small one. I go to like the 1.2 or the 1.5. But this time of year, go big. There's something about the forage is bigger, the threadfin shad are bigger, the perch are bigger, everything's bigger because they haven't had a chance to spawn yet, and make smaller babies. So go big in the pre-spawn and the post-spawn. Now, the areas are really critical. When you're talking about using a square bill, you have a lot more of a limited specific range they work in. First of all, you have to have the right water clarity. And the right water clarity, guys, you've got to have stained water for a square bill to work. Sometimes if you use like a crawfish pattern, it'll open it up for a little bit cleaner water. But for the most part, when I'm fishing a square bill, I'm fishing it in water visibility of anywhere between, say, 8 inches visibility to maybe 2 foot at the most. Sort of a foot to 2 foot is going to be really, really good with that. So you've got to have a lake that has that type of water clarity for this technique to be, highly productive. One thing I found out is if you start getting in water visibility that's over 2 feet, unless you are out there on a rainy, cloudy, super windy day using some type of a crawdad pattern, you're not going to catch many on a square bill. So for all practical purposes, when I'm talking about a square bill, I'm talking about either some type of a shad pattern or a bright pattern like this blackback chartreuse, which is my favorite color in the spring by far. If you can only have one square bill color in the springtime of the year, blackback chartreuse is hard to beat. I know a lot of guys like the crawdad pattern, and that can be productive too under certain situations, but the specific type of way that I'm going to describe fishing this, I've just done a lot better on the blackback chartreuse side. So let's talk a little bit about the pre-spawn when it works good. First of all, again, it's all directly related to the combination of the cover you're fishing, the water clarity, and the water temperature. The closer that you get to the conditions I'm going to describe here, the better your odds of catching them on a square bill are going to be. Now, the best scenario in the pre-spawn time of the year for a square bill is when the water temperature is in the mid to upper 50s and you've got dirty water visibility again between less than a foot to up to 2 foot, and you've got rock cover and you've got fish in shallower water. Because if you've got rock cover and it's during the pre-spawn and you've got stained water, if you've got normal weather conditions like where it's not unbelievably cold or windy or post-frontal or something like that, you're going to have a good number of fish starting to move up shallow in that 2 to 4 foot range and living on those rocks. So what I like to do is I go back into the major creek arms when that water temperature is in the mid to upper 50s. I go probably halfway to 2/3 of the way back in the creeks, and I try to find the steepest, rockiest structure that I can find. It could be a bluff bank, it could be a channel bank or whatever, but I like to have some type of mixed rock on it. Sometimes I like a little bit bigger rock. The bigger mixed rock will get those fish shallower up on that bank and get them in the zone to catch them on that square bill. And most of the time, guys, with that, I'm getting the boat pretty close to the bank, paralleling the bank, not making real long casts, making just like a medium cast, maybe 30, 40 foot cast, something like that. Usually fishing it on 15 to 20 pound test Seaguar and Viz X line, and just trying to keep contact with the bottom. medium retrieve, medium stop and go retrieve. Always try to hit something. It's like with the square bill, if you're not hitting something, you're probably not going to be catching many fish. So the 2.0 guys for this, I hear it's going to run, if you put it on 15-pound test, fluorocarbon line, you're probably going to be able to hit, 5 or 6 foot of depth on a long cast. So this is really effective for probing that 3 to 5 foot range where a lot of those fish are in. So that's my number one thing as far as for the pre-spawn. Now for the post-spawn, sort of the same deal. They sort of get on the same type of deals. They get out there and they move back onto the main part of the creek after they get done spawning. But the difference between the post-spawn and the pre-spawn is in the post-spawn, wood becomes more of a factor. If you've got some lay down trees, if you got stumps in the water, any type of wood cover, docks or whatever like that, the square bill crankbait is going to be really, really good in the post-spawn after that. Deflecting off of that wood, basically throwing it up there. Again, reeling it a medium fast retrieve, not a medium fast, but a medium retrieve, stop and go, trying to deflect off those limbs, and that's a really good way to catch them in the post spawn. But guys, some of the biggest fish that I've caught, some of the biggest stringers of bass I've caught, especially in the pre-spawn, have been on square bill crankbaits. Really good during the pre-spawn. A lot of people don't realize it with that. Okay, sort of in the same line here, condition-wise and situation-wise. Next one I'm going to talk about is just the old full-size jig. Just an old school jig, guys. This is my custom jig here. Usually like a 3/8 ounce with a large trailer on it. Big full-size jig. Old school as it gets. Black and blue, green pumpkin, black and chartreuse. You sort of just have to match it with the water clarity. But guys, in the springtime of the year, it works all springtime of the year, you can't beat a jig under certain situations. Now there's a lot of nuances and there's a lot of differences as far as when they work. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about, pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn. During this pre-spawn, guys, I'm looking for the dirtiest water I can find. Just like the square bill, I go back into those creek arms, I look for that water visibility in 1 to 2 foot. Doesn't matter if it's rock, wood, grass, lily pad stems, whatever. I'm taking this 3/8 ounce jig, pitching it and flipping it around any shallow cover, especially if that water temperature is in the 50s. This is a really good way to catch them. It's also a really good way to catch them on a sunny day. If you've got a bright sunny day, you got some stained water and you've got water temperatures in the 50s, that activates those fish to really, really eat a jig. So what I'll do is I'll try to target those shady areas on those bright days, up underneath that dock, pitching it next to a shady side of the stump or lay down. Anything like that's going to be really, really good for a jig. Probably my favorite, if you gave me one favorite structure to fish a jig in the pre-spawn, it would be around docks, if you do have docks. Either docks or riprap, channel banks, larger rocks, something like that. Throw it out there, let it hit the bottom, hop it 5 or 6 inches off the bottom, work it about halfway back to the boat. In the spawn actually is a good time to fish a jig too. That's normally when I go to some type of a green pumpkin. Same type of a deal. As if I think those fish are spawning, I get up there in those same type of areas where I think they're spawning and I just fish whatever cover is available. If there's shallow wood, grass, docks, whatever, I'm back in those spawning type areas, just pitching and flipping that jig around those same type of areas can be really good. So in essence, during the spawn, I've moved off the main part of the creek back into the coves. That's the only transitional change. And guys, in the post-spawn, which is my favorite time of year to fish a jig in the spring, is any time that you have flooded cover, which is very common in the post-spawn. Most of the time, if you have a lake where the lake comes up where you flood bushes and trees and stuff like that, it is in May or June. Not a better bait to flip and pitch than a jig. It's absolutely my favorite. If you give me the post-spawn situation with flooded willow trees and flooded bushes, that's my idea of a perfect bass fishing scenario. I'll put that jig on 25-pound test Seaguar line, Megabass Alkalies flipping stick, and I'll just pitch all that flooded cover, really trying to figure out, the color that the fish want, if they want that jig hopped hard off the bottom, if they want it on the outside of the bush, if they want it on the inside of the bush, really trying to break that down. Super, super fun way to fish. So jig, square bill crankbait, works a lot in the same type of area. So take another quick break. We'll be right back. Okay, guys, moving right along here. We've got 4 more baits left we're going to talk about. And the next one I'm going to talk about is very similar in line to the jig, what we're talking about. And that's this Megabass sleeper craw. Guys, this has rapidly became the last 2 years since I've been using this thing, one of my favorite springtime lures. I've had more success on the sleeper crawl than any other time of the year that I fished it out there. And guys, this is really good in two scenarios during the springtime of the year. It's good anytime that you're fishing around docks or rocks. It's like, I don't care, you know, if it's a floating dock or if it's a pier type dock or if it's a bluff bank or if it's chunk rock bank, anything like that. Pitching and flipping this sleeper craw on the rocky banks or around docks is a killer way to catch them. It'll also, it's like, I don't recommend it, but guys, if this thing, anywhere you get around a bedding bass, they attack this thing like crazy, even though I don't condone bedding fish, but they don't, you know, crawdads eat eggs. So bass are, you know, adamant about getting them off the eggs, off the nest in there, but they will attack that thing on a nest. But the main thing with that, guys, if I am fishing, you know, during the pre-spawn, spawn, or post-spawn, and I've got any type of a channel bank leading back into a spawning cove, I do the same thing with the sleeper crawl that I do with the jig out there. Just slowly, methodically pitch and flip along those rocks, any shallow cover, anything like that. Most of the sleeper crawls, guys, they got black ones, but most of them are in some type of a naturalistic crawl like this. So therefore, I like it in a little bit cleaner water. Most of the time I'm using it anytime the water visibility is over 3 feet, but it's just a really, really good crawfish imitator out there. And there's something about it, you know, when those fish get closer to spawn and they really like this thing, just what we were talking about earlier about them not wanting to chase a bait, you know, they'll hit it when it's going right along the bottom. And most of the time I work it just like a jig, put it on 15-pound tests, Seaguar Vizex, throw it out there and just slowly hop it back to the boat. Same type of deal as the jig bite. Okay, the next one we're getting into, guys, this is a completely different category, is a glide bait. This is the Megabass 187. There's a lot of different glide baits out there, whatever your favorite is. But in terms of a glide bait, I'm talking about something sort of in that 7-inch range. That seems to be the ideal length range for the springtime of the year. Now, the glide bait is good all through spring. It'll catch them in the pre-spawn, the spawn, and the post-spawn. This is like one of the funnest baits to fish in the springtime of year because there's not another time of year that's better to fish a glide bait, in my opinion, than during the springtime of the year. Another thing about a glide bait, it'll show you where a lot of fish are at because, say, for example, on the Megabass here or any big glide bait, if you have, in a course of a day, say if you have a good day of glide bait fishing, you may have 10 bass follow the bait and you may have 2 or 3 of them actually attack it and eat it. But it shows you where the fish are at. So if you're fishing this glide bait and you see fish following it in, don't hesitate to throw right back in there with that wacky rig. It's a really good 1-2 punch behind a glide bait. You're gonna catch a lot more fish on the wacky rig than you will on the glide bait itself. And sometimes if you have one of those big ones, like a 5 or 6 or 7 pounder, following this thing and not eating it, you can catch them on the wacky rig, just tossing it right in behind it there. Now, a couple different things on this with the glide bait as far as scenarios, you know, specifics on it. Again, everything we talk about, it's a combination of your water temperature and your water clarity together. That's what determines so much about bass fishing, period, along with a glide bait. Now, for a glide bait, I do want clean water. For the most part, I don't fish a glide bait unless the water is like at least 3 foot clarity. And I like it, ideally 4 to 5 foot is perfect for a glide bait. So that's the number one thing, is like 3 foot or clear type water. If you get into like cleaner water than 6 foot of visibility, you really have to have a specific type of weather day for the thing to work. But if you got 3 to 5 foot of visibility, you're in a perfect scenario for a glide bait to work. Now, a glide bait is extremely weather specific. It's like there's not another lure category out there besides a glide bait or even a big swim bait. I sort of put the big swim bait in the same category, like this mag draft, 8-inch mag draft here, very similar to that. But when you're fishing a big glide bait or swim bait in the springtime of the year, number one, you got to have wind. If you don't have wind, you're going to basically get nothing but followers. Wind will really activate those fish to actually bite the thing and not just follow it. So I like a windy day, 15 to 20 miles an hour wind's perfect. And I do like some type of a considerable overcast. You don't have to have it. You don't have to have it overcast, but it helps. I like at least 75% coverage. You know, sun may be peeking out once in a while, but most of the time it's not. combined with that strong wind, combined with the clear water, combined with that water temperature between say 57 to 70 degrees, perfect scenario for a glide bait, especially pre-frontal. So that wind really needs to be out of the south. Once that wind switches around after front to the north or east, they just don't bite a glide bait very good at all. It's a pre-frontal bait. It's a bait that is geared to do well if the fish are aggressive and active. It's a very situational bait. But given that, even though it's a situational bait, it produces some giant fish. So you can't not deny it. You can't not throw it. So most of the time with it, guys, on a glide bait, is a typical glide bait. When you just reel it through the water, it just sort of swims like that, slowly through the water. But I prefer to fish it like a jerk bait. So what I'll do is I'll cast it out there and I'll sort of jerk it slow like that. And what happens is it goes like this and stops and back forth like that. It gives it a lot more aggressive lifelike action because you can keep this thing in sight. That's another thing, is you want to keep these glide baits in sight as much as possible and just twitch it like that and just sort of sometimes just go like that and let it set for a second, then maybe make a little half twitch and it'll go like that, and just sort of play with it. Make it sort of look like a live minnow. But you're going to catch a lot more fish if you can actually see the bait working and you can actually read the bait around the fish. And another thing about a glide bait or a big swim bait is if you're fishing it like this through the water and all of a sudden you see this big tank of a fish come up on it, speed the thing up. It's like, go like that. Just try to get it away from it. Just jerk it like that and reel it real fast, almost like you're going to pop it out of the water. Because if you just keep working the bait like that when you see a fish after it, it is such a obvious bait. They get too good of a look on it and they'll never hit it. But if you try to get it away from them real quick, they don't have any choice. They either have to come and get it or they have to ignore it. Now, I'm not saying they get it every time, but your odds of catching one on a follower are far greater if you try to get that thing away from them very quick out there. They'll just react to it sometimes like that. Most of the time, glide bait, heavy equipment, guys, heavy tackle. I usually fish it on 25-pound test Seaguar and Vizex line, and I usually fish it on that 8-foot Megabass Leviathan rod. You want a stiff rod. If you have a glide bait that is over, say, 3 or 4 ounces, it's even too big for a flipping stick. So try to go to those super powerful rods with it like that. Now, as far as fishing it around stuff, when you're fishing the big swim bait or the glide bait, there's 2 different scenarios that they work really good in during the springtime of the year. Number one, for me, it's all about fishing windy banks and points. The fish are going to be in different stages throughout the spring. So you're not targeting spawning fish with a glide bait and a swim bait. You want to target those late pre-spawners and the early post-spawners, and that you're going to find those fish on the secondary points like we talked about with the shaky head, windy banks, anything like that. Just covering water with it, hitting as many windy points as you can in a day, hitting as many windy banks as you can in a day. The only way that you're going to catch them on an open water point or open water bank is if it's windy. Since there's nothing for a fish to ambush and hide around, you got to have those low light conditions with the clouds and the wind and all that type of stuff. But if you throw this thing around docks or logs, say for example, you throw it next to a dock corner or there's a big stump in the water and you throw it next to a stump where the fish can ambush a glide bait, a lot of times you got a lot better chance to catch that fish, where that fish will actually eat the bait simply because they react to it like a reaction strike. Open water fish on a glide bait, they're tough to catch unless you got the perfect situations. But if you throw this thing next to an object, it really ups your odds of actually catching those fish and getting those fish to hit the bait a little bit better. So anyway, that's the big glide baits and everything, swim baits. So we'll be back here in a second with our final 2 lure categories. So be right back. Okay guys, we're back with our final 2 lure categories for spring fishing here. So we'll get into that. Next one, guys, is the old school spinnerbait. Spinnerbait is hard to beat in the springtime of the year, in early spring specifically, and then again a little bit in the pre-spawn. Now also, guys, one of the things I'll say about a spinnerbait is a lot of times you can interchange a spinnerbait with a chatterbait. Sometimes the situations I'm going to describe to you guys for the spinnerbait can sometimes be even better with the chatterbait. So when you're thinking in terms of springtime spinnerbait fishing, always think in terms of chatterbait, spinnerbait, spinnerbait, because sometimes they want one over the other. Sometimes the chatterbait's a little bit more, productive, especially when the fish are wanting to key in on that vibration. And then the spinnerbait can be a little bit more productive if they're more sight oriented on the blade. So a lot of times you just have to mix it up and experiment. So springtime fishing with a spinnerbait, two different scenarios. My favorite, one of my top 3 favorite bass fishing techniques of all time is fishing a big spinnerbait in the pre-spawn time of the year when the water temperature's in the 50s. Take like a 3/4 ounce spinnerbait with a number 6 willow leaf blade, slow roll it around whatever shallow cover you're fishing. It doesn't really matter. It's like if your lake has grass or lily pads in it, slow roll it around that. If you're like here in the Ozarks where I'm at, slow roll it around the steeper rocky banks. Whatever cover that you have, but slow rolling a big spinnerbait when the water temperature's in the 50s is a great way to catch big bass. There's something about it that triggers those big ones, because I think there's a lot of really big threadfin and gizzard shad during the pre-spawn. That works really good with it. Again, like any type of a larger lure that requires a commitment for the bass to hit, you need the right type of day for spinnerbait fishing. You need low light conditions. You need off-colored water for the most part. Although in the fall time of the year, spinnerbait can be really good in clean water, but in the springtime, I like the off-colored, sort of like in that maybe 1 to 3 foot zone is sort of perfect for that. Another thing with springtime pre-spawn spinnerbait fishing, they like to be on a little bit steeper type of bank out there. I don't catch many fish on those real flat banks in the pre-spawn, but I like the channel banks that drop off like a 45 or 60 degree angle. And I'll throw that spinnerbait up on the bank and I'll just sort of let it fall down the ledge. So I'll throw it up there. If my boat's say in 15 or 20 foot of water, I'll just sort of slowly crawl it. And if I feel like if it's getting up too high in the water column, I'll just, let it sink back down to the bottom, start bringing it up again, but try to keep it like a foot or so off the bottom. If you've watched some of my other videos, I've talked about this before. Guys, I bet probably, I bet 75% of the big bass I've ever caught in my life during the pre-spawn have come on slow rolling a big spinnerbait. It is absolutely probably one of the best ways to catch a big one you're ever going to find. And there's a small window for it. Most of the time that window is between, like, that water temperature's got to be 53 to 58 degrees. It's like sort of the magic water temperature. So if you get a condition like that where you got March day, water temperatures in the mid 50s, you got a cloudy, windy day, you got water visibility of 1 to 3 feet, put you on a big spinnerbait. It's definitely going to get you some bites. Now, the spinnerbait goes through a lull when the fish are really focused on spawning, when that water temperature is in the 60s. But once that water temperature starts to get up close to 70 and those fish are done spawning, what happens is another really good pattern is, and this is usually generally sometime in early May that I'm talking about, this is the first spawn for the threadfin and gizzard shad of the year. Normally what happens is when those bass are done spawning, and they're pretty much finished up with spawning, that's when the shad start spawning. The shad will spawn on any type of hard object in the lake. They'll spawn around a dock corner, they'll spawn around riprap banks, they'll spawn around rocky banks. And guys, there's not a better bait to catch bass in the post-spawn time of the year shallow than on just like this Megabass SB3, a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait, fishing it around those areas those shad are spawning. Now, the thing about a shad spawn is you guys have probably heard of people talking about fishing the shad spawn. You can't just like go out and look for it. It's like you find shad spawning just while you're fishing, because a lot of times, say you'll be fishing down a boat dock, down a road, just down a bank sometimes, or just down some bank. And there may be 2 or 3 boat docks on it, and all of a sudden you'll be going around the outside of one dock and you'll notice a ball of shad spawning like on one of the dock corners. Or maybe you're fishing between some docks on a riprap bank and you notice some shad spawning up, flickering on the surface, spawning right there on the rocks. So take advantage of that when you see it. And most of that spawning activity is going to be early in the morning. It's like from usually about 10 o'clock that they quit spawning, and they don't do it again until late at night or early in the morning. But when you see those shad flickering, spawning shallow on the rocks on the docks, throw a little 1/2 ounce spinnerbait next to it, just fish it like maybe 2 or 3 inches under the water, and they will come up and just smoke a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait in the post spawn with that. So that's a spinnerbait deal. Now the last one I'm gonna talk about, guys, is a buzzbait. Buzzbait is one of my favorite spring lures. Again, you know, horizontal lure presentation, it's not going to work that great when the fish are actually spawning. But there's two windows, just like we've talked about in most of the baits here, where buzzbait works really good. One during the pre-spawn and one during the post-spawn. And the mood and the personality for a buzzbait fish is completely different in the pre-spawn versus the post-spawn. Now the pre-spawn, it is highly situational. It's like every lure we've talked about is very highly situational, except for like the wacky rig and the shaky head that work under a lot of conditions. But a buzzbait is probably the most, you know, situationally specific lure that you're gonna fish out there. You gotta have just the right conditions for a buzzbait to work in the pre-spawn. First of all, you need a big buzzer. You need a big black buzzer. This is the Megabass Jamaican bow. It's got a big blade on it. It's a 3/4 ounce bait. They like a big buzzer when that water temperature is in the 50s. So when that water temperature is in the mid to upper 50s, maybe sometimes even lower 50s, that's when I start fishing this big buzzbait. And I'm reeling it, I keep my rod, I throw it out there and I keep my rod tip high, and I'm reeling it just fast enough to keep it on the surface, or it's going bloop, 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 bloop. You know, it's almost like where it's ready to go under the water. I'm fishing it that slow, but I just want those blades barely turning above the water in that little bit colder water. And I'm fishing it on the days where you have abnormally warm early spring days. Say, for example, you're out there and the water temperature is 53, 54 degrees, and you get one of those days that maybe maybe a front's on the way and you got some type of warming trend, and the air temperature is maybe 5 degrees above normal, and you got a southerly airflow, you got some clouds out there. All that warming condition, the low light and the warm water conditions and the warm air, will make a fish bite a big buzzbait when the water temperature is in the 50s. It's a great way to catch big ones. I mean, the average fish you probably catch during the pre-spawn on a buzzbait is at least 3 pounds. It's a quality fish pattern that a lot of people don't get onto. Black is definitely the color. Now what happens is after the fish spawn, they get back on the buzzbait, but you have to go small. You have to go to a little bitty buzzer. So here's the one that I use, the Jamaican bow in the pre-spawn, but you can see the difference in the post-spawn. I downsized to like a little 1/8 ounce or a little 1/4 ounce buzzer, just a fraction of the size of the big one here. And guys, in the post-spawn, they love a little finesse buzzbait. I don't know what it is about it, but I catch a ton of fish after the fish spawned on this little 1/4 ounce buzzer here. And normally in that situation, I'm fishing it in the same type of areas that the fish have been spawning in, especially if you have a little bit off-colored water. In order for these buzzers to work, you've got to have that water visibility sort of between 1 to 3 feet. So for the little buzzer in the post-spawn, let's say for example, the fish, you think most of the fish are done spawning. Say you'll go back into a spawning cove and maybe you can look and see some beds out there, but there's nothing on them. You know the fish are done spawning. That's when the little buzzer works good. So you want to concentrate on spawning areas. You want to concentrate on flat banks that have some type of shallow cover. If you guys have a lake that has any type of shallow vegetation like lily pad stems, gator grass, water willows, perfect place for a little 1/4 ounce buzzer in the post spawn. It's one of my favorite areas to fish it, is around, you know, lily pads and that type of stuff. And that's going to work out pretty much all the way through May, you know, until those fish start moving into their summer patterns a little bit more. But anyway, guys, that is my selection for advanced techniques on spring fishing out there. I do use a lot of other stuff, but when it comes down to it, I just want to reiterate in this that if you stay with the wacky rig and the shaky head for your bread and butter, this is going to get you bites day in and day out. And then under the right situations, you know, go to your Glidebaits, go to your Spinnerbaits, go to your top waters, your crankbaits, you know, and your jigs and something like that, and just you know, sort of match the technique to the conditions that you have. But I'm hoping what this video does, I hope it sort of gives you a guideline to where to begin with. And I've had a chance to fish like 45 springs on lakes across the country, 45 different spring seasons. And what I just talked about there are my most successful techniques and my most successful lures that I've used over the past 45 years. So anyway, guys, I hope it helps you guys catch a few more fish, and we'll see you guys next week.